So we'll give just a couple minutes as usual, and then we will start the reading. And so we will begin. The spirit has been called, and we will go. As always, the Discord is where I like to focus on taking people's messages, because if you at me on Discord, I can my phone will buzz, so that way I know when someone has something to say to me. Otherwise, I get caught up in reading. Okay, we're getting into today Atlantis and the gods of Antiquity. This is a big topic. May I preface this with saying that history is not as people think it is. We are taught many stories and narratives of history, but every timeline of a historical projection is just a story. When you're told that tale that they teach you in the public school of civilization began in Mesopotamia, and then humans were born out of Africa, they went to Mesopotamia, and then they learned everything they needed to know in Mesopotamia, and then went and conquered everywhere else. The migration patterns and things, those are real. I mean, we have real archaeological data. I'm not saying that the archaeological data is wrong. What I am saying is that the story that we project back on it is just a projection. It's just a projected story. And we don't know the story of those peoples and those times the way that we think that we know them. And so if you come to this and say, well, Atlantis, that's ridiculous. That's a wrong way of thinking, because in the breadth of human experience, there is much more room for things to be than we give it credit for. We think that everything must fit within our little frame of reality, but the truth is that the past, the ancient past especially, is much, much vaster than we give it credit for and that we understand. And there are things back there that have remnants in us today that are important. And it's the remnants and the ideas and symbols that pass into us that are the important things about Atlantis. It's not important where it physically was. It's not important to find it again. Those things are not important. There's not as important as the ideas that come from Atlantis to us. The idea of Atlantis itself is a valuable idea. And this is why Plato gave it to us. So, with that said, let's begin. Atlantis is the subject of a short but important article appearing in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution for the year ending June 30th, 1915. The author, M. Pierre Termier, a member of the Academy of Sciences and Director of Service of the Geologic Chart of France, in 1912 delivered a lecture on the Atlantean hypothesis before the Institut Oceanographique. It is the translated notes of this remarkable lecture that are published in the Smithsonian Report. After a long period of disdainful indifference, writes Monsieur Termier, observe how in the last few years science is returning to the study of Atlantis. How many naturalists, geologists, zoologists, or botanists are asking one another today whether Plato has not transmitted to us with slight amplification a page from the actual history of mankind. And I will say, look into alternative histories. Look into the work of Graham Hancock. Look into the work of Joseph P. Farrell. Look into the work of, even Zacharias Sitchin, if you'd like to. His translations of Sumerian are disputed and things like that, but there are things in those Sumerian texts that you would not believe, and if you read them for yourself, you'll see that the history of man is much vaster than people give it credit for. If you take those people at their word, if you believe that ancient people were stupid, then and they just made shit up all the time, then I guess you could discard it. But if you think that they were as serious as you and I are today, and as intelligent, which I believe they were as serious and intelligent as they could be in their day, and we may be slightly more, but no more than a hair's breadth. They knew these things and they passed them down. They knew what was going on, and so when you read the works of someone like Graham Hancock or Joseph P. Farrell, talking about ancient, talking about, for example, the Giza Death Star or Babylonian banksters, those things, those are very, very old ideas, very, very old roots to the world that exists today. And understanding where banking came from, finance, understanding where economics came from is all part of understanding this one great mythological tree. Why do you think that there's a pyramid with the all-seeing eye on the back of the $1 bill? It's because it's the mystery schools that are printing your money. You need to understand that the mystery schools are the ones who are printing your money. And they manipulate it to their own ends. And to some extent, that's okay. They have goals that we do not know. But anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked into politics type things, but when we're talking about Atlantis and alternative history type subjects, look up those names, Graham Hancock and Joseph P. Farrell in particular, Zecharia Sitchin as well, to broaden your horizons on what could be true, what evidence is out there that points to alternative theories other than the mainstream narrative. And there is much. And I studied history in university, and that's what I learned, is that essentially history is, if you think that history is complete and that you know it, then you're wrong. You've created a homunculus. You've created a false world. That's the demiurge. Okay. No affirmation is yet permissible, but it seems more and more evident that a vast region, continental or made up of great islands, has collapsed west of the Pillars of Hercules, otherwise called the Strait of Gibraltar, and that its collapse occurred in the not far distant past. In any event, the question of Atlantis is placed anew before men of science, and since I do not believe that it can ever be solved without the aid of oceanography, I have thought it natural to discuss it here. In this temple of maritime science, and to call to such a problem, long scorned but now being revived, the attention of oceanographers, as well as the attention of those who, though immersed in the tumult of cities, lend an ear to the distant murmur of the sea. I'll also say, add to this, that being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints myself, Atlantis is a deeply connected mythology with the mythology of the Nephites and the Lamanites that you find in the Book of Mormon. The Nephites and the Lamanites came across the Pacific Ocean to land in South America or Central America, South or Central America, and the evidence for high civilization in South and Central America is much. There is much evidence for high civilization there that we do not understand. But that civilization has almost completely been lost and destroyed, which is exactly what the Book of Mormon says. It's just that when we call them different names. We say instead of Mayans, they're called Nephites. So, anyway, if you read the Book of Mormon, put an ear to that. Keep your ear out for that set of ideas. In his lecture, Monsieur Termier presents geologic, geographic, and zoologic data in substantiation of the Atlantis theory. Figuratively draining the entire bed of the Atlantic Ocean, he considers the inequalities of its basin and cities' locations on a line from the Azores to Iceland, where dredging has brought lava to the surface from a depth of 3,000 meters. The volcanic nature of the islands now existing in the Atlantic Ocean corroborates Plato's statement that the Atlantean continent was destroyed by volcanic cataclysms. Monsieur Termier also advances the conclusions of a young French zoologist, Monsieur Louis Germain, who admitted the existence of an Atlantic continent connected with the Iberian Peninsula and with Mauritania, and prolonged toward the south so as to include some regions of desert climate. Monsieur Termier concludes his lecture with a graphic picture of the engulfment of that continent. I've included on the thumbnail of this YouTube video the Richat structure in Morocco. Many of you might be familiar with that. It's quite a remarkable structure, and I think we'll look at some pictures of it later. I'll bring them up so that we can look at them, because it's definitely a thing worth noting. The description of the Atlantean civilization given by Plato in the Critias may be summarized as follows. In the first ages, the gods divided the earth among themselves, proportioning it according to their respective dignities. Each became the peculiar deity of his own allotment, and established therein temples to himself, ordained a priestcraft, and instituted a system of sacrifice. To Poseidon was given the sea, and the island continent of Atlantis. In the midst of the island was a mountain, which was the dwelling place of 3 earth-born primitive human beings, Evenor, his wife, Leucippe, and their only daughter, Cleito. The maiden was very beautiful, and after the sudden death of her parents, she was wooed by Poseidon, who begat by her 5 pairs of male children. Poseidon apportioned his continent among these 10, and Atlas, the eldest, he made overlord over the other 9. Poseidon further called the country Atlantis, and the surrounding sea the Atlantic, in honor of Atlas. Before the birth of his 10 sons, Poseidon divided the continent and coastwise sea into concentric zones of land and water, which were as perfect as though turned upon a lathe. 2 zones of land and 3 of water surrounded the central island, which Poseidon caused to be irrigated with 2 springs of water, one warm and the other cold. And this is something that's very, very important to understand, is that there's a concept called the cosmic war. This is a concept that you can find in almost every pagan tradition, is that there was a war among the gods at some point. The gods went to war. And we live in a post-war world. We live in a post-apocalyptic world. There was a previous apocalypse. People just don't understand how well it's been, how well the earth is healed. The earth heals very quickly. But this previous apocalypse was about 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Lesser Dryas period, at the end of the last ice age, essentially. This period has a lot of sites like Göbekli Tepe, which are very interesting, fascinating religious sites. But all of these things, mythologically, when we look back through the mystery traditions, we see that the traditions point us to this war between the gods. A war between the god of water, who is Enki in Sumerian mythology. Enki was the god of water, or the fish god, Jesus, Enki. And Enlil, who was the god of earth, who's Yahweh. And Jesus and Enlil, that's a funny way to put it. Enki and Enlil, fought over mankind, over the topic of mankind, over whether or not we should be free over what our position should be. And they disagreed. So keep the cosmic war myth in your mind. I hope you're familiar with it, and if you are not, I invite you to seek it out, because that myth is one of the foundational myths that will help you to understand the formation of the world. Search it out by seeking the Sumerian and Babylonian texts. The work by Joseph P. Farrell on that is good. You can find, he relates how those things can be seen as actual documents like we have today. It's just a different way of thinking. They had a different symbolic language. They had a different way of writing things than we do today. They wrote more symbolically than we do, but they were a very advanced civilization, as advanced as us, I would assume. I don't know what that means as per technology, but I think that spiritual advancement is what I'm referring to. And when the crop has been reaped, then the field is tilled, and the earth is tilled, and a new crop is grown. Okay, so the description of the Atlantean civilization given by Plato. Okay, we just read that. One warm and the other cold. The descendants of Atlas continued as rulers of Atlantis, and with wise government and industry elevated the country to a position of surpassing dignity. The natural resources of Atlantis were apparently limitless. Precious metals were mined, wild animals domesticated, and perfumes distilled with its fragrant flowers. While enjoying the abundance natural to their semi-tropic location, the Atlanteans employed themselves also in the erections of palaces, temples, and docks. They bridged the zones of the sea and later dug a deep canal to connect the outer ocean with the central island, where stood the palaces and temple of Poseidon, which excelled all other structures in magnificence. A network of bridges and canals was created by the Atlanteans to unite the various parts of their kingdom. Plato then describes the white, black, and red stones which they quarried from beneath their continent and used in the construction of public buildings and docks. They circumscribed each of the land zones with a wall, the outer wall being covered with brass, the middle with tin, and the inner, which encompassed the citadel, with orichalc. The citadel on the central island contained the palaces, temple, and other public buildings. In its center, surrounded by a wall of gold, was a sanctuary dedicated to Plato and Poseidon. Here the first 10 princes of the island were born, and here each year their descendants brought offerings. Poseidon's own temple, its exterior entirely covered with silver and its pinnacles with gold, also stood within the citadel. The interior of the temple was of ivory, gold, silver, and orichalc, even to the pillars and floor. The temple contained a colossal statue of Poseidon standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. About him 100 Nereids riding on dolphins. Arranged outside the building were golden statues of the first 10 kings and their wives. In the groves and gardens were hot and cold springs. There were numerous temples to various deities, places of exercise for men and for beasts, public baths, and a great race course for horses. At various vantage points on the zones were fortifications, and to the great harbor came vessels from every maritime nation. The zones were so thickly populated that the sound of human voices was ever in the air. That part of Atlantis facing the sea was described as lofty and precipitous, but about the central city was a plain sheltered by mountains renowned for their size, number, and beauty. The plain yielded 2 crops each year, in the winter being watered by rains and in the summer by immense irrigation canals, which were also used for transportation. The plain was divided into sections, and in time of war each section supplied its quota of fighting men and chariots. The 10 governments differed from each other in details concerning military requirements. Each of the kings of Atlantis had complete control over his own kingdom, but their mutual relationships were governed by a code engraved by the first 10 kings on a column of orichalc standing in the temple of Poseidon. At alternate intervals of 5 and 6 years, a pilgrimage was made to this temple, that equal honor might be conferred upon both the odd and the even numbers. Here, with the appropriate sacrifice, each king renewed his oath of loyalty upon the sacred inscription. Here also the kings donned azure robes and sat in judgment. At daybreak they wrote their sentences upon a golden tablet and deposited them with their robes as memorials. The chief laws of the Atlantean kings were that they should not take up arms against each other, and that they should come to the assistance of any of their number who was attacked. In matters of war and great moment, the final decision was in the hands of the direct descendants of the family of Atlas. No king had the power of life and death over his kinsmen without the assent of a majority of the 10. The scheme of the universe according to the Greeks and Romans. Just going to take a quick look at the chats here. See if anyone's saying anything. Doesn't look like it. We're having a quiet night. That's okay. Okay, let's take a look at this. The scheme of the universe according to the Greeks and Romans. So here we have the world, spirits of the air, excuse me, various flights of angels, spheres of angels, and then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, and Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Saturn was the extent of the universe as they knew it at the time. This is the human-centric universe. It's not necessarily, this is the thing that people make a mistake about. Don't confuse the physical for the metaphysical. You can say that the heliocentric universe, or the heliocentric model, is true, but the geocentric model is also true in that from the observations of mankind, it was what they saw outside of them. So it was this symbolic language that was created. They had they would see the stars moving in the sky. The planets were the wanderers. They would see their retrograde motion, and that's how they knew that they were planets. By observing over and over again these same things happening in the sky and saying, wow, that's weird, they created this this metaphysical cosmos. And their metaphysical cosmos, the thing is that it isn't wrong. It's just not the physical reality. And it's okay for a metaphysical reality to not line up with the physical reality directly, because it's a multidimensional thing. You know, it's like saying it's okay for a cube to have faces that face the opposite direction. It's because it's multidimensional. It needs a face that point, it needs faces that point both directions. It needs faces in two different places. That's how it works.
So when we're talking about these things are always multidimensional. Okay. By ascending successively through the fiery sphere of Hades, the sphere of water, earth, and air, and the heavens of the moon, the plane of Mercury is reached. Above Mercury are the planes of Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the latter containing the symbols of the zodiacal constellations. Above the arch of the heavens, Saturn is the dwelling place of the different powers controlling the universe. The Supreme Council of the Gods is composed of 12 deities, 6 male and 6 female, which correspond to the positive and negative signs of the zodiac. The 6 gods are Jupiter, Vulcan, Apollo, Mars, Neptune, and Mercury. The 6 goddesses are Juno, Ceres, Vesta, Minerva, Venus, and Diana. Jupiter rides his eagle as the symbol of his sovereignty over the world, and Juno is seated upon a peacock, the proper symbol of her haughtiness and glory. Remember that paganism never died. It was just pulled in,
Whitewashed, and became the church of Jesus Christ. It was incorporated into the church that we now know as the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox. Both of those churches prior to the schism were heavily involved in understanding of these astrological symbols. These astrological symbols are written directly into the Bible. Jesus Christ himself says, "Follow the man who carries water. Find the man who carries water and follow him into his house." And that's where you'll prepare the Passover feast. And Passover feast is the feast on the full moon after the vernal equinox. Plato concludes his description by declaring that it was this great empire which attacked the Hellenic states. So he's claiming that there was an actual war between the Hellenic states and the Atlantic states. So what you're hearing here is that there was a war between Zeus and Poseidon. There was a war between Jesus and Yahweh. There was a war between Enki and Enlil. And what was this war about? It was about how man should be treated. And who won the war? Zeus. But who is God over all? Yahweh. That was the conclusion of the war. Okay. This did not occur, however, until their power and glory had lured the Atlantean kings from the pathways of wisdom and virtue. Filled with false ambition, the rulers of Atlantis determined to conquer the entire world. Zeus, perceiving the wickedness of the Atlanteans, gathered the gods into his holy habitation and addressed them. Here Plato's narrative comes to an abrupt end, for the Critias was never finished. In the Timaeus is a further description of Atlantis, supposedly given to Solon by an Egyptian priest, and which concludes as follows. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of rain all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared, and was sunk beneath the sea.
And that is the reason why the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is such a quantity of shallow mud in the way. And this was caused by the subsidence of the island. Why would they say that there was such a quantity of shallow mud? I'm genuinely curious about that. I have no answer for that. Shallow mud in the Atlantic. I mean, I guess it could be that the Atlantic just was different then. It's hard to say. It's hard to say what any time was like in particular. But we continue. In the introduction to his translation of the Timaeus, Thomas Taylor quotes from A History of Ethiopia, written by Marcellus, which contains the following reference to Atlantis, where they relate that in their time there were 7 islands in the Atlantic Sea, sacred to Proserpine, and besides these 3 others of an immense magnitude, one of which was sacred to Pluto, another to Ammon, and another, which is the middle of these, and is of 1,000 stadia, to Neptune. Crantor, commenting upon Plato, asserted that the Egyptian priests declared the story of Atlantis to be written upon pillars which were still preserved 300 BC. See beginnings or glimpses of vanished civilizations. Ignatius Donnelly, who gave the subject of Atlantis profound study, believed that horses were first domesticated by the Atlanteans, for which reason they have always been considered peculiarly sacred to Poseidon. From a careful consideration of Plato's description of Atlantis, it is evident that the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as both allegorical and historical. That's an important thing. That's often how the ancients communicated. It was both symbol and truth. It was both allegory and fact. But they did not necessarily line up. It was because they were speaking the language of the heart at the same time that they were speaking the language of the mouth, the language of the mind. The language of the mind is the language of ideas, of things that are around us, of measuring and calculating. But the language of the heart is symbolic. From a careful consideration of Plato's description of Atlantis, it is evident that the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as both allegorical and historical. Origen, Porphyry, Proclus, Iamblichus, and Syrianus realized that the story concealed a profound philosophical mystery, but they disagreed as to the actual interpretation. Plato's Atlantis symbolizes the threefold nature of both the universe and the human body. The 10 kings of Atlantis are the tetractys, or numbers, which are born as 5 pairs of opposites. Consult Theon of Smyrna for the Pythagorean doctrine of opposites. This is philosophical. See, the numbers 1 to 10 rule every creature. I think that the number are actually 0 to 9, but that's one of the secrets of the mystery schools, was the number 0. The number 0 was considered a big discovery. I mean, it was known. It was a mystery. The number 0 was a mystery. The numbers 1 to 10 rule every creature, and the numbers, in turn, are under the control of the monad, or 1, the eldest among them. With the trident scepter of Poseidon, these kings held sway over the inhabitants of the 7 small and 3 great islands comprising Atlantis. Philosophically, the 10 islands symbolize the triune powers of the superior deity and the 7 regents who bow before his eternal throne. If Atlantis be considered as the archetypal sphere, then its immersion signifies the descent of rational, organized consciousness into the illusionary and permanent realm of irrational mortal ignorance. Both the sinking of Atlantis and the biblical story of the fall of man signify spiritual involution, a prerequisite to conscious evolution. Either the initiated Plato used the Atlantis allegory to achieve 2 widely different ends, or else the accounts preserved by the Egyptian priests were tampered with to perpetuate the secret doctrine. This does not mean to imply that Atlantis is purely mythological, but it overcomes the most serious obstacle to acceptance of the Atlantis theory, namely the fantastic accounts of its origin, size, appearance, and date of destruction, 9,600 BC, about 12,000 years ago. It's 11,600 years ago. In the midst of the central islands of Atlantis was a lofty mountain which cast a shadow 5,000 stadia in extent, and whose summit touched the sphere of ether. This is the axle mountain of the world, Mount Meru. This is the world axle, the world root, the mountain of the world. Very important symbol. This is the axle mountain of the world, sacred among many races and symbolic of the human head, which rises out of the 4 elements of the body. This sacred mountain, upon whose summit stood the temple of the gods, gave rise to the stories of Olympus, Meru, and Asgard. The city of the Golden Gates, the capital of Atlantis, is the one now preserved among numerous cities as the city of the gods, or the holy city. Here is the archetype of the New Jerusalem, with its streets paved with gold and its 12 gates shining with precious stones. The history of Atlantis, writes Ignatius Donnelly, is the key of the Greek mythology. There can be no question that these gods of Greece were human beings. The tendency to attach divine attributes to great earthly rulers is one deeply implanted in human nature. The same author sustains his views by noting that the deities of the Greek pantheon were not looked upon as creators of the universe, but rather as regents set over it by its more ancient original fabricators. The Garden of Eden, from which humanity was driven by a flaming sword, is perhaps an allusion to the earthly paradise supposedly located west of the Pillars of Hercules and destroyed by volcanic cataclysms. The deluge legend may be traced also to the Atlantean inundation, during which a world was destroyed by water. The flood myth we have covered before, but is universal. The Druids had the flood myth, as we recall, and of course the Bible has the flood myth. The Sumerians have the flood myth, and here we see that the Greeks with Atlantis have a flood myth. And this myth always has to do something with unrighteous civilization and the fate of mankind. The Bible does not mention a war between the gods, but many things do. It may not have been an actual war, but it may have just been a disagreement that caused them to start over. Yeah. With which the world was destroyed by water. The history of Atlantis, writes Ignatius Donnelly, is the key of Greek mythology. I feel like we haven't gone over some of these things enough. Both the sinking of Atlantis and the biblical story of the fall of man signify spiritual involution, a prerequisite to conscious evolution. It was the prerequisite world to this world. And it is a historical fact that you can find evidence for, and you should look for evidence. Am I the only one here? With the trident. Okay. Either the initiated Plato used the Atlantis allegory to achieve two widely different ends. Plato was an initiate, and perhaps he did use it to achieve widely different ends. That's pretty interesting. He made a very skillful use of his words and his stories. And you will find that skillful means is a mark of the wise throughout the world. In Buddhism, it is particularly regarded highly, skillful means. Okay. The same author sustains his view by noting that the deities of the Greek pantheon were not looked upon as creators of the universe, but rather as regents set over it by its more ancient original fabricators. There is the one ultimate God, and there are these gods who are above us. This is very important for people to understand. There are gods above us. There are beings above us. But
they they mostly don't interfere
in earthly life. There's a specific purpose for Earth
and for your life here that precludes them from interfering in it. That was the subject of the war. That was what the war was fought for, was to give you the freedom of choice. That is to say, you are not ruled over by the gods because of that war that was fought. That was won by Zeus, by Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the one that won that war. And that is why the one church that you see today that incorporates all these things is the Church of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ is the one that settled this and said mankind must be given its free agency to choose whether or not to have faith in God. You must have your free agency to choose. And by having the gods play on the earth, they had tainted their own experiment. The Nephilim came down and they begat sons, and there were giants on the earth in those days. That's biblical. What the meaning of this is that these gods came down and they bred with the people of the earth, and there were giants on the earth in those days. There were many crazy things. We're talking like Dungeons and Dragons magic, crazy. And at that time, it was very obvious to people that the supernatural existed because they could see it everywhere, all the time. But the war was fought to contain that. Why? Why was the war fought to contain that? It was fought to contain that because this place is a testing ground for human beings, or for the soul, for the spirit of the children of God. And this place that you come, you are brought here so that you might learn, so that they can see if you will triumph by following God's word alone, by having faith. If you will triumph through faith, or if you will falter in darkness and fall. So you're given the opportunity to make your decisions in life, to go whichever way you want. And at the end of your life, you will receive what you have given forth.
This is a teaching that has been given through all the ages. I just pass it on to you now. Was the religious, philosophic, and scientific knowledge possessed by the priestcrafts of Antiquity secured from Atlantis, whose submergence obliterated every vestige of its part in the drama of the world progress? Atlantean sun worship has been perpetuated in the ritualism and ceremonialism of both Christianity and pagandom. Both the cross and the serpent were Atlantean emblems of divine wisdom. The divine Atlantean progenitors of the Mayas and Quiches of Central America coexisted within the green and azure radiance of Gukumats, the plumed serpent. The 6 sky-born sages came into manifestation as centers of light, bound together or synthesized by the 7th, and chief of their order, the feathered snake. The title of winged or plumed snake was applied to Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, the Central American initiate. The center of the Atlantean wisdom religion was presumably a great pyramidal temple standing on the brow of a plateau rising in the midst of the city of the Golden Gates. From here the initiate priests of the sacred feather went forth, carrying the keys of universal wisdom to the uttermost parts of the earth. The mythologies of many nations contain accounts of gods who came out of the sea. Certain shamans among the American Indians tell of holy men dressed in birds' feathers and wampum who rose out of the blue waters and instructed them in the arts and crafts. Among the legends of the Chaldeans is that of Oannes, a partly amphibious creature who came out of the sea and taught the savage peoples along the shore to read and write, till the soil, cultivate herbs for healing, study the stars, establish rational forms of government, and become conversant with the sacred mysteries. These things were taught unto us, unto the people of this earth, unto your fathers and mothers of your physical bodies. Your physical ancestors were part of this process and culture. And everyone has had a part in this great story of the earth, and you should be proud of that. You should be proud of the part that your ancestors took in this, because they struggled and they triumphed and they led to you. And you should not receive your life and not pass it down. You should pass down the chain. So have some babies, have some children, and pass the torch to the next generation. Among the Mayas, Quetzalcoatl, the savior god, who some Christian scholars believe to have been St. Thomas. It could have been St. Thomas, but I think that it was Jesus Christ. Issued from the waters and instructing the people in the essentials of civilization, rode out to sea on a magic raft of serpents to escape the wrath of the fierce god of the fiery mirror, Tezcatlipoca. May it not have been that these demigods of a fabulous age who, Esdras-like, came out of the sea were Atlantean priests? All that primitive man remembered of the Atlanteans was the glory of their golden ornaments, the transcendency of their wisdom, and the sanctity of their symbols, the cross and the serpent. That they came in ships was soon forgotten, for untutored minds considered even boats as supernatural. Wherever the Atlanteans proselyted, they erected pyramids and temples patterned after the great sanctuary and the city of the Golden Gates. Such is the origin of the pyramids of Egypt, Mexico, and Central America. The mounds in Normandy and Britain, as well as those of the American Indians, are remnants of a similar culture. In the midst of the Atlantean program of world colonization and conversion, the cataclysms which sank Atlantis began. The initiate priests of the sacred feather, who promised to come back to their missionary settlements, never returned, and after the lapse of centuries, tradition preserved only a fantastic account of gods who came from a place where the sea now is. H.P. Blavatsky thus sums up the causes which precipitated the Atlantean disaster. Under the evil insinuations of their demon, Thevatat, the Atlantis race became a nation of wicked magicians. In consequence of this, war was declared, the story of which would be too long to narrate. Its substance may be found in the disfigured allegories of the race of Cain, the giants, and that of Noah and his righteous family. Let he who has ears listen. The conflict came to an end by the submersion of the Atlantis, which finds its imitation in the stories of the Babylonian and Mosaic flood. The giants and magicians and all flesh died, and every man, all except Xerxes and Noah, who are substantially identical with the great father of the Tlinkithians in the Popol Vuh. Tlinkithians. That's an interesting name. Tlinkithians in the Popol Vuh, or the sacred book of the Guatemalans, which also tells of his escaping in a large boat, like the Hindu Noah, Vaisvata. Vaisvata is that's what is a Hindu counterpart of this. The reason why these myths exist everywhere is that they're true. So that's the nature of things. From the Atlanteans, the world has received not only the heritage of arts and crafts, philosophies and sciences, ethics and religions, but also the heritage of hate, strife, and perversion. The Atlanteans instigated the first war, and it has been said that all subsequent wars were fought in a fruitless effort to justify the first one and right the wrong which it caused. Sadly so. Before Atlantis sank, its spiritually illumined initiates, who realized that their land was doomed because it had departed from the path of light, withdrew from the ill-fated continent. Carrying with them the sacred and secret doctrine, these Atlanteans established themselves in Egypt, where they became its first divine rulers. Nearly all the great cosmologic myths forming the foundation of the various sacred books of the world are based upon the Atlantean mystery rituals. Yeah, this advanced civilization because it was addicted to the mind and not the spirit, it killed itself. It killed itself. And we are the continuation of that. The civilization that was existent back then they are much like us. They are not some distant weird thing, but they are more like us than you would like to believe. You have to wake up your heart to the love of your fellow man in order to turn from that path for us, or else the path will continue and history will repeat itself. That is the way that these things happen. History is not a circle, but it's a spiral. And so we come back to the same position of history as the past. And those positions are told by our astrological ages. The astrological age that we're entering now is the age of Aquarius, and we are entering into a great new age where the man who carries water will bring life to the world. So, get ready for that. The man who carries water will bring life to this world. The myth of the dying god. The myth of Tammuz and Ishtar is one of the earliest examples of the dying god allegory, probably antedating 4000 BC. See Babylonia and Assyria by Lewis Spence. The imperfect condition of the tablets upon which the legends are inscribed makes it impossible to secure more than a fragmentary account of the Tammuz rites. Being the esoteric god of the sun, Tammuz did not occupy a position among the first deities venerated by the Babylonians, who, for lack of deeper knowledge, looked upon him as a god of agriculture or a vegetation spirit. Originally, he was described as being one of the guardians of the gates of the underworld. Like many other savior gods, he is referred to as a shepherd, or the lord of the shepherd's seat. Tammuz occupies the remarkable position of son and husband of Ishtar, the Babylonian and Assyrian mother goddess. Ishtar, to whom the planet Venus was sacred, was the most widely venerated deity of the Babylonian and Assyrian pantheon. She was probably identical with Astaroth, Astarte, and Aphrodite. Astarte. The story of her descent into the underworld in search, presumably, for the sacred elixir, which alone could restore Tammuz to life, is the key to the ritual of her mysteries. Tammuz, whose annual festival took place just before the summer solstice, died in midsummer in the ancient month which bore his name, and was mourned with elaborate ceremonies. The manner of his death is unknown, but some of the accusation made against Ishtar by Itzdubar, who's Nimrod, would indicate that she, indirectly at least, had contributed to his demise. The resurrection of Tammuz was the occasion of great rejoicing, at which time he was hailed as a redeemer of his people. With outspread wings, Ishtar, the daughter of Sin, the moon, sweeps downward to the gates of death. The house of darkness, the dwelling of the god Urkala, is described as the place of no return. It is without light. The nourishment of those who dwell therein is dust, and their food is mud. Over the bolts on the door of the house of Urkala is scattered dust, and keepers of the house are covered with feathers like birds. Ishtar demands that the keepers open the gates, declaring that if they do not, she will shatter the doorposts and strike the hinges, and raise up dead devourers of the living. The guardians of the gates beg her to be patient while they go to the Queen of Hades, from whom they secure permission to admit Ishtar, but only in the same manner as all others came to this dreary house. Ishtar thereupon descends through the 7 gates which lead downward into the depths of the underworld. At the first gate, the great crown is removed from her head. At the second gate, the earrings from her ears. At the third gate, the necklace from her neck. At the fourth gate, the ornaments from her breast. At the fifth gate, the girdle from her waist. At the sixth gate, the bracelets from her hands and feet. And at the 7th gate, the covering cloak of her body. Ishtar remonstrates at each successive article of apparel is taken from her. But the guardian tells her that this is the experience of all who entered the somber domain of death. Enraged upon beholding Ishtar, the mistress of Hades inflicts upon her all manner of disease and imprisons her in the underworld. This is what a lot of mysteries are talking about. And this was done in the Great Pyramid. You would descend in a shaft, and they would take from you the ritual clothing you had on until you had nothing, until the high priestess had nothing on. And then she would go and engage in ritual copulation with the male who was representing Osiris. Osiris and Isis, in this case. This is one of the temple mysteries, the ritual union of creation. It's a beautiful thing, and you should not think lightly of it. As Ishtar represents the spirit of fertility, her loss prevents the ripening of the crops and the maturing of all life upon the earth. In this respect, the story parallels the legend of Persephone. The gods, realizing the loss of Ishtar, is disorganizing all nature. Send a messenger to the underworld and demand her release. The mistress of Hades is forced to comply, and the water of life is poured over Ishtar. Thus cured of the infirmities inflicted on her, she retraces her way upward through the 7 gates, at each of which she is reinvested with the article of apparel which the guardians had removed. No records existed that Ishtar secured the water of life which would have wrought the resurrection of Tammuz. The myth of Ishtar symbolizes the descent of the human spirit through the 7 worlds or spheres of the sacred planets, until finally, deprived of its spiritual adornments, it incarnates in the physical body, Hades, where the mistress of that body heaps every form of sorrow and misery upon the imprisoned consciousness. The water of life, the secret doctrine, cure the diseases of ignorance, and the spirit, ascending again to its divine source, regains its God-given adornments as it passes upward through the rings of the planets. Another mystery ritual among the Babylonians and Assyrians was that of Merodach and the dragon. Merodach, the creator of the inferior universe, that is, the demiurge, slays a horrible monster, and out of her body forms the universe. Here is the probable source of the so-called Christian allegory of St. George and the dragon. All of these old mythologies, they all echo each other, and they all have the same things at heart. It's very, very important to trace back and realize how similar they are, what their similar roots are. The mysteries of Adonis, or Adonai, were celebrated annually in many parts of Egypt, Phoenicia, and Byblos. The name Adonis or Adonai means Lord, and was a designation applied to the sun and later borrowed by the Jews as the esoteric name of their god. Smyrna, mother of Adonis, was turned into a tree by the gods, and after a time the bark burst open and the infant Savior issued forth. According to one account, he was liberated by a wild boar which split the wood of the material tree with its tusks. Adonis was born at midnight of the 24th of December, and through his unhappy death a mystery rite was established that wrought the salvation of his people. In the Jewish month of Tammuz, another name for this deity, he was gored to death by a wild boar sent by the god Mars. The Adoniasmos was the ceremony of lamenting the premature death of the murdered god. In Ezekiel 8:14, it is written that women were weeping for Tammuz, Adonis, at the north gate of the Lord's house in Jerusalem. Sir James George Fraser cites Jerome thus: he tells us that Bethlehem, the traditionary birthplace of the Lord, was shaded by a grove of that still older Syrian lord Adonis, and that where the infant Jesus had wept, the lover of Venus, was bewailed. So beautiful. The world is so beautiful. See the golden bow. The effigy of a wild boar is said to have been set over one of the gates of Jerusalem in honor of Adonis, and his rites celebrated in the grotto of the Nativity at Bethlehem. Adonis, as the gourd or god-man, is one of the keys to Sir Francis Bacon's use of the wild boar in his cryptic symbolism. Adonis was originally an androgynous deity who represented the solar power, which in the winter was destroyed by the evil principle of cold, the boar. After 3 months in the tomb, Adonis rose triumphant on the 25th day of March, and amidst the acclamation of his priests and followers. He is risen. Adonis was born out of a myrrh tree. Myrrh, the symbol of death because of its connection with the process of embalming, was one of the gifts brought by the 3 magi to the manger of Jesus. The 25th day of March is meant to be the spring equinox. So it should be the 21st day, actually, rather than the 25th.
But the 25th day, and Christmas should be on December 21st as well. But the date was moved for reasons of obfuscation. The past was obfuscated on purpose. It was purposefully wiped away so that mankind would have the ability to live without coercion from the gods, that they would develop on their own, and then they would see the true nature of mankind, whether we were good or evil. It's a test. Humanity is being tested to join the celestial kingdom. Okay. Months, the 25th day of March, amidst the acclamations of his priests and followers. He is risen. He is risen. In the mysteries of Adonis, the neophyte passed through the symbolic death of God and, raised by the priests, entered into the blessed state of redemption made possible by the sufferings of Adonis. Nearly all authors believe Adonis to have been originally a vegetation god directly connected with the growth and maturing of flowers. Adonis is the sun. Adonis is Jesus Christ. The great god Pan. The great Pan was celebrated as the author and director of the sacred dances, which he is supposed to have instituted to symbolize the circumambulations of the heavenly bodies. Pan was a composite creature, the upper part, with the exception of his horns, being human, and the lower part in the form of a goat. Pan is the prototype of natural energy, and while undoubtedly a phallic deity, should not be confused with Priapus. The pipes of Pan signify the natural harmony of the spheres, and the god himself is a symbol of Saturn because the planet is enthroned in Capricorn, whose emblem is a goat. The Egyptians were initiated into the mysteries of Pan, who was regarded as a phase of Jupiter, the demiurgus. Pan represented the impregnating power of the sun and was the chief of the horrid rustic deities and satyrs. He also signified the controlling spirit of the lower worlds. He fabricated a story to the effect, I don't know what that sentence is saying. He fabricated a story to the effect that at the time of the birth of Christ, the oracles were silenced after giving utterance to one last cry, "Great Pan is dead." Here we see Pan with his flute, 7 notes, and the spheres. And you see here the triumph of Jesus over the God of the earth. Sometimes these things don't line up because people got various gods confused a lot. They got the various gods confused because their powers appeared similar. So they made human errors. And so there are many human errors in these things. And that's what we see in that picture. This picture shows us
hieroglyphical representation of Jupiter or Pan, and then we see in the description here, it says the fabricated story of the time of birth of Christ. The oracles were silenced after giving the utterance to one last cry, "Great Pan is dead." Well, Great Pan, the horned god, is actually Saturn, not Jupiter. And Saturn is Yahweh. And Jupiter is Zeus, is Jesus. And Jesus he didn't defeat El. It wasn't really a war, because the gods don't really fight. It was a Jesus turned to the Heavenly Father, Saturn, and said, "I have a plan to save the people of Earth." And a heavenly plan was put into place, and that is the plan of salvation, which is in place for all of us. Okay. In Phrygia there existed a remarkable school of religious philosophy which centered around the life and untimely fate of another savior god known as Attis, or Attis, or Attis, by many considered synonymous with Adonis. The deity was born at midnight on the 24th day of December. Of his death there are two accounts. In one he was gored to death like Adonis, in the other he emasculated himself under a pine tree and there died. His body was taken to a cave by the Great Mother, Cybele, where it remained through the ages without decaying. To the rites of Attis, the modern world is indebted to the symbolism of the Christmas tree. Open your ears. He who has ears, let him hear. Attis imparted his immortality to the tree beneath which he died, and Cybele took the tree with her when she removed the body. Attis remained 3 days in the tomb, rose upon a date corresponding with Easter morn, and by this resurrection overcame death for all who were initiated into his mysteries. In the mysteries of the Phrygians, says Julius Firmicus, which are called those of the mother of the gods, every year a pine tree is cut down, and in the inside of the tree the image of a youth is tied in. In the image of Isis, the tree of a pine tree is cut. The trunk of a pine tree is cut. The middle of the trunk is nicely hollowed out. The idol of Osiris made from those hollowed pieces is buried. In the mysteries of Proserpine, a tree cut is put together into the effigy and the form of the Virgin, Virgo. And when it has been carried within the city, it is mourned 40 nights, and the 40th night it is burned. See Sod, the mysteries of Adonai. These old-fashioned pagan rituals have to do with the stars and veneration of the stars. The old gods are coming back. There will be a great unveiling soon. The mysteries of Attis included a sacramental meal during which the neophyte ate out of a drum and drank from a cymbal. After being baptized by the blood of a bull, the new initiate was fed entirely on milk to symbolize that he was still a philosophical infant, having but recently been born out of the sphere of materiality. See Fraser's The Golden Bow. Is there a possible connection between this lacteal diet prescribed by the Attic Rite and St. Paul's allusion to the food for spiritual babies? Sallust gives a key to the esoteric interpretation of the Attic rituals. Cybele, the Great Mother, signifies the vivifying powers of the universe. The Attis, that aspect of the spiritual intellect, which is suspended between the divine and animal spheres. The mother of the gods, loving Attis, gave him a starry hat, signifying celestial powers, but Attis, mankind, falling in love with a nymph, symbolic of the lower animal propensities, forfeited his divinity and lost his creative powers. It is thus evident that Attis represents the human consciousness, and that his mysteries are concerned with the reattainment of the starry hat. See Sallust on the Gods and the World. The rites of Sabazius were very similar to those of Bacchus, and it is generally believed that the two deities are identical. Bacchus was born at Sabazius, or Sabaoth, and these names are frequently assigned to him. The Sabazian mysteries were performed at night, and the ritual included the drawing of a live snake across the breast of the candidate. Clement of Alexandria writes, "The token of the Sabazian mysteries to the initiated is the deity gliding over the breast. A golden serpent was the symbol of Sabazius because this deity represented the annual renovation of the world by the solar power. The Jews borrowed the name Sabaoth from these mysteries and adopted it as one of the appellations of their supreme god. During the time the Sabazian mysteries were celebrated in Rome, the cult gained many votaries and later influenced the symbolism of Christianity. The Kabiric mysteries of Samothrace were renowned among the ancients, being next to the Eleusinian in public esteem. Herodotus declares that the Samothracians received their doctrines, especially those concerning Mercury, from the Pelasgians. Little is known concerning the Kabiric rituals. Little is known concerning the Kabiric rituals, for they were enshrouded in the profoundest secrecy. Some regard the Kabiri as 7 in number and refer to them as the 7 spirits of fire before the throne of Saturn. Before the throne of Saturn. Let he who has ears hear. Others believe the Kabiri to be the 7 sacred wanderers, later called the planets. While a vast number of deities are associated with the Samothracian mysteries, the ritualistic drama centers around 4 brothers. The first 3, Ascieros, Asciersus, and Asciersa, Achiochersa, Ascieros, Achiochersus, attack and murder the 4th, Kashmala or Cadmilus. Hiram Abif pops up in my head. Dionysius, however, identifies Ascurus with Demeter, Asacersus with Pluto, Asacersa with Achiochersa with Persephone, and Kashmala with Hermes. Alexander Wilder notes that in the Samothracian ritual, Cadmilus is made to include the Theban serpent god Cadmus, the Thoth of Egypt, the Hermes of the Greeks, and the Emeph or Asclepius of the Alexandrians and the Phoenicians. Here again is a repetition of the story of Osiris, Bacchus, Adonis, Balder, and Hiram Abif. There you go. The worship of Attis and Cybele was also involved in the Samothracian mysteries. In the rituals of the Kabiri is to be traced a form of pine tree worship, for this tree, sacred to Attis, was first trimmed into the form of a cross and then cut down in honor of the murdered god whose body was discovered at its foot. If you wish to inspect the orgies of the Corbanites, or the Corbantes, writes Clement, then know that, having killed their third brother, they covered the head of the dead body with a purple cloth, crowned it, and carrying it on the point of a spear, buried it under the roots of Olympus. These mysteries are, in short, murders and funerals. The ante-Nicene Father, in his efforts to defame the pagan rites, apparently ignores the fact that, like the Kiberian martyr, Jesus Christ was foully betrayed, tortured, and finally murdered. The priests of these rites, who are called kings of the sacred rites by those whose business it is to name them, give additional strangeness to the tragic occurrence by forbidding parsley with the roots from being placed on the table, for they think that parsley grew from the Corbantic blood that flowed forth, just as the women, in celebration of the Thrasymophoria, abstain from eating the seeds of the pomegranate which have fallen on the ground, from the idea that pomegranates sprang from the drops of the blood of Dionysus. Those Corybantes also they call Kabiric, and the ceremony itself they announce as the Kabiric mystery. The mysteries of the Kabiri were divided into 3 degrees, the first of which celebrated the death of Kashmala at the hands of his 3 brothers. The second, the discovery of his mutilated body, the parts of which had been found and gathered after much labor. And the third, accompanied by great rejoicing and happiness, his resurrection and the consequent salvation of the world. The temple of the Kabiri at Samothrace contained a number of curious divinities, many of them misshapen creatures representing the elemental powers of nature, possibly the Bacchic Titans. Children were initiated in the Kabirian cult with the same dignity as adults, and criminals who reached the sanctuary were safe from pursuit. The Samothracian rites were particularly concerned with navigation. This is something that pops up a lot. Joseph P. Farrell's work covers this some. The maps that were made in olden times were far more accurate than we know today. Not more accurate than we have today. We have very accurate maps today, obviously. But I mean, what we know of their maps, they had much better maps than what we know of them. They had much better everything than what we know of them. We presume that they were lower than us or worse off, but the truth is that they were doing quite well for a long time. Humans have been doing quite well for a long time. Okay. Herodotus relates that when Cambyses entered the temple of Kabiri, he was unable to restrain his mirth at seeing before him the figure of a man standing upright, and facing the man, the figure of a woman standing on her head. Had Cambyses been acquainted with the principles of divine astronomy, he would have realized that he was then in the presence of the key to universal equilibrium. I ask, says Voltaire, who were these hierophants, these sacred Freemasons, who celebrated their ancient mysteries of Samothracia, and whence came their gods Kabiri? See Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. Clement speaks of the mysteries of the Kabiri as the sacred mysteries of a brother slain by his brethren, and the Kabiric death. Clement speaks of the Kabiri as the sacred mystery of the brother slain by his brethren, and the Kabiric death was one of the secret symbols of antiquity. Thus, the allegory of the self murdered by the not-self is perpetuated through the religious mysticism of all peoples. The philosophic death and the philosophic resurrection are the lesser and the greater mysteries respectively. A curious aspect of the dying god myth is that of the hanged man. The most important example of this peculiar conception is found in the Odinic ritual, where Odin hangs himself for 9 nights from the branches of the world tree, and upon the same occasion also pierces his own side with a sacred spear. As the result of this great sacrifice, Odin, while suspended over the depths of the Niflheim, discovers by meditation the runes or alphabets by which later the records of his people were preserved. Because of this remarkable experience, Odin is sometimes shown seated on a gallows tree, and he became the patron deity of all who died by the noose. Esoterically, the hanged man is the human spirit which is suspended from heaven by a single thread. We are all hanged men. We are all hanged men. Wisdom, not death, is the reward for this voluntary sacrifice, during which the human soul, suspended above the world of illusion and meditating upon its unreality, is rewarded by the achievement of self-realization. From a consideration of all these ancient and secret rituals, it becomes evident that the mystery of the dying god was universal among the illumined and venerated colleges of the sacred teaching. This mystery has been perpetuated in Christianity in the crucifixion and death of the God-man Jesus Christ. Jesus the Christ. Jesus the anointed. Christ means anointed. Take upon ye the name of Christ. Take upon ye the anointment. Be anointed. That means to enter into the mysteries. You have to go into a temple and be initiated in order to call yourself by the name of Christ. You become one in the body of Christ. The secret import of this world tragedy and the universal martyr must be rediscovered if Christianity is to reach the heights attained by the pagans in the day of their philosophic supremacy. That's what we're doing right now. We are precisely right now raising up Christianity to the height of pagan philosophy. That's what we're doing at this very moment. The myth of the dying god is the key to both universal and individual redemption and regeneration, and those who do not comprehend the true nature of this supreme allegory are not privileged to consider themselves either wise or truly religious. Wow, that's a powerful condemning statement. The myth of the dying god is the key to both universal and individual redemption and regeneration. And those who do not comprehend the true nature of this supreme allegory are not privileged to consider themselves either wise or truly religious. That's an amazing thing. These mysteries are so amazing. They are always so amazing. There's so much to learn from them. Going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you very much for joining me. I love all of you, my brothers and sisters, and I leave these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ.